Nathan Cross stood outside the Imperial Palace on Veltharion Prime, staring at architecture designed to make visitors feel insignificant and wondering if he'd made a catastrophic mistake. 5 years of searching. 5 years of following fragmented leads, tracking down obscure historical records, and piecing together information about a girl he'd known for 3 years during the worst period of his childhood. A girl named Kess who'd been his only friend on the failed frontier colony of New Meridian, who'd shared his hunger and his fear and his desperate attempts to find fun in ruins, who'd vanished during the chaotic evacuation when the colonial venture collapsed. He'd assumed she'd made it out safely, had spent decades trying not to think about the friend who'd understood what loneliness felt like even when surrounded by people. Then 6 months ago, he'd seen a photograph in a historical documentary about the Veltharion Empire. A coronation ceremony from 40 years ago featuring their newly ascended empress. And there, in the background of one frame, was a face that made his breath stop. Kess, older, wearing formal regalia, surrounded by courtiers, but unmistakably the alien girl who'd played with him in abandoned buildings and laughed at his terrible jokes about Earth animals she'd never seen. His childhood friend wasn't just alive. She was Empress Kesvala Tel Veltharion, absolute ruler of a stellar empire spanning 14 systems. The discovery had been impossible to process, then impossible to ignore, and now Nathan was here trying to convince Imperial guards that he had legitimate reason to request audience with their sovereign. "Sir," the security officer said with patience that was wearing thin, "this is the 4th time you've attempted to gain access to the palace. The Empress does not grant audiences based on claimed childhood friendships supported only by fragmented memories and one blurry photograph." "I know it sounds insane," Nathan said, which was at least honest. "But I knew her, on New Meridian before the colony collapsed. She went by just Kess then. We were friends." "Many people claim connections to the Empress," the officer said. "It's a common scam. Please leave before we're forced to formally ban you from palace grounds." Nathan was trying to figure out if there was any argument that wouldn't sound desperate when something impossible happened. The Empress herself appeared in the security checkpoint. She was flanked by guards whose posture suggested they were very confused about why their sovereign was personally responding to a routine security incident, but Kesvala ignored them entirely. Her eyes locked on Nathan, and her skin shifted through colors that made the guards reach for their weapons because their empress had just made a sound like she'd been struck. "Nathan," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that made the single word sound like prayer and accusation and disbelief all at once. Then she was moving, crossing the checkpoint with speed that made her guards panic because empresses didn't run toward random humans claiming childhood friendship, except apparently this one did. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough to touch but not touching, and her eyes held something that looked like grief transforming into joy, transforming into confusion about which emotion should take precedence. "You're alive," she said, and her hands were shaking in ways that violated every protocol about imperial dignity. "I thought you died in the collapse. I mourned you for 40 years. She stopped, processing implications. "You didn't know who I was. You called me Kess, just Kess you never knew." Nathan's brain was struggling to reconcile the friend he remembered. A girl who'd stolen ration packs with him and hidden in abandoned buildings, with the Empress wearing a crown and commanding guards who looked ready to kill him if he moved wrong. "I just found out 6 months ago," he admitted. "Saw your coronation photograph, recognized you even after all this time." Kesvala's colors shifted through patterns Nathan didn't have vocabulary to interpret. "You've been looking for me for 6 months. 5 years, actually," Nathan corrected. "I've been trying to find you since I started having the resources to search properly. The photograph just told me where to look." Something in her expression cracked. "Come with me. Guards, he's not a threat. She stopped, seemed to struggle with words. "He's the boy from New Meridian, the one I told you about, the friend I thought was dead." The guards looked at each other with expressions suggesting this was above their authorization level, but when an empress gave orders, you followed them. Kesvala's private chambers were nothing like the intimidating architecture of the public palace. Instead of displays of power, Nathan saw personal space filled with objects that looked like they had meaning. Artwork, books, small sculptures that suggested aesthetic preferences rather than political statements. And in one corner, preserved in a stasis field, was a battered metal tin that made Nathan's breath catch. "You kept the ration tin," he said, staring at the container they'd used to store their stolen food supplies during the worst months on New Meridian. "I kept everything," Kesvala said quietly. "Everything I could salvage before the evacuation. Everything that reminded me of the only person who ever treated me like I was just Kes rather than the exiled ere my guardians were desperately hiding." Nathan turned to stare at her. "Exiled heir. My family fled a succession crisis when I was very young," Kesvala explained. "Remaining in the empire would have meant my death. Youngest heirs are often eliminated to simplify succession disputes. New Meridian was supposed to be anonymous refuge where I could grow up outside the palace's deadly politics." Her colors shifted through patterns suggesting old pain. "My guardians told me to hide my identity, to pretend to be just another refugee child, to never reveal the truth that could get us all killed if rivals found us. So when we were friends, Nathan tried to process what this meant. I was hiding who I was every moment," Kesvala finished. "Pretending to be normal refugee when I was actually royalty learning what life felt like outside a palace. Every conversation we had, every game we played, happened while I was carrying secrets I couldn't tell you because telling you could have gotten both of us killed." Nathan sat down heavily in the chair she indicated, trying to reconcile his fragmented memories of shared childhood with the reality that his friend had been someone else entirely. "Why didn't you try to find me after you became empress? You had resources. You could have tracked me down if you wanted." "Because I thought you were dead," Kesvala said, and her voice cracked. "The colony collapse killed hundreds. Records were destroyed. I searched for you in the survivor lists and found nothing. For 40 years, I believed you died on New Meridian." She moved to a display panel, activated it. "But even believing you were dead, I never forgot. Because my species doesn't forget the way humans do." The holographic display showed what looked like crystalline neural mapping. "Veltharian practice memory crystallization at maturity," Kesvala explained. "It's a biological process that preserves childhood experiences in perfect neural stasis. Humans have fragmentary recollections that fade and distort over time. We have absolute clarity." "You remember everything?" Nathan asked, processing the implications. "Everything," Kesvala confirmed. "Every conversation we had, every game we played in the ruins. The time you defended me from the older kids who thought I was strange. The day you shared your last ration pack because you noticed I hadn't eaten." She pulled up a memory crystal, activated it. The room filled with holographic recreation. Two children sitting in an abandoned building, sharing food, talking about what they'd do when they grew up. The holographic Nathan was maybe 10 years old, gap-toothed and earnest, promising holographic Kes that wherever they ended up, they'd stay friends. "I've watched this memory hundreds of times," Kesvala admitted. "Whenever ruling became too difficult, whenever I felt isolated by power, I'd remember that there was one person who knew me before the crown, who liked me when I was just Kes." She looked at Nathan with 40 years of accumulated loneliness in her eyes. "You were my only real friend, the only being who ever saw me rather than my potential value or threat. And I spent 4 decades believing you were dead, keeping your memory crystallized as reminder of who I was before power consumed everything else." "I barely remember half of what you're showing me," Nathan said quietly, watching the holographic children. "Human memory doesn't work like that. I have impressions, fragments, emotions more than details." "I know," Kesvala said, But even fragmentary, your memories matter. Because you're here, you're alive. And you spent 5 years trying to find me despite only remembering fragments. Her colors shifted through patterns that might have been gratitude or hope or something Nathan couldn't identify. That means something. They talked for hours, trying to bridge 4 decades and fundamentally different relationships to their shared past. Nathan described his life after New Meridian, education on Earth, career as an engineer, marriage that ended in amicable divorce, children who were grown now with their own lives. His existence had been ordinary in ways that felt embarrassing to describe to someone who ruled empires. But Kesvala listened like he was describing the most fascinating thing she'd ever heard. "You got to be normal," she said, and her voice carried something like envy. "You got to make choices based on what you wanted rather than what power demanded. You got to have relationships that weren't tainted by people wanting something from your position. You got to be Nathan instead of Empress. And you got to rule 14 star systems," Nathan countered. "That seems like it might compensate for the lack of normalcy." "Does it?" Kesvala asked. "I command fleets, reshape economies, decide policies affecting billions of lives. But I haven't had a genuine friend since New Meridian because power makes authentic connection almost impossible. Everyone sees the crown before they see the person. Everyone wants something from my authority rather than just wanting to spend time with Kes." She pulled up another memory crystal, showed Nathan a scene he didn't remember at all. The two of them laughing about something, their younger selves collapsed against each other in the kind of unself-conscious joy that children manage and adults forget how to achieve. "I remember the exact joke you told," Kesvala said. "It was about an earth animal called a penguin and why they would be terrible at hiding during games. You acted it out with your arms tucked in and waddled around until I laughed so hard I couldn't breathe." She smiled at the memory. "I didn't understand why penguins were funny, but I understood that you were trying to make me laugh because I'd been sad about something I can't even remember now. You remember that more clearly than I remember what I had for breakfast last week," Nathan said. "Memory crystallization preserves everything equally," Kesvala confirmed. "Significant moments and trivial ones, all with perfect clarity. It's blessing and curse. I can revisit the best experiences whenever I want, but I can also never escape the worst ones." Like the colony collapse. Her colors darkened. "Like watching the evacuation chaos and thinking I saw you board a transport that I later learned exploded during atmospheric exit. Like 40 years of believing my only real friend was dead, because I was too scared to search harder and confirm what I thought I'd witnessed." "I'm not dead," Nathan said gently. "I'm here. And I spent 5 years trying to find you despite barely remembering half our childhood, because what I did remember mattered enough to search for." "Why?" Kesvala asked. "You had normal life, human life, people who knew you as Nathan rather than as childhood companion to alien royalty. Why risk that stability to find someone who might not even remember you?" "Because you were my only friend too," Nathan said simply. "And I wanted to know if you'd made it out, if you'd survived, if the girl who shared rations and played in ruins had grown up to have a good life. And instead you found an empress." "I found Kes," Nathan corrected. "She just happens to also be an empress. That's not a disqualifier for friendship unless you decide it is." Kesvala stared at him with expression suggesting she was processing something profound. "Everyone else sees the crown first. You're looking past it. I'm looking at the person who shared her last ration pack with a human kid who was too stubborn to admit he was starving," Nathan said. "The crown is just what happened after. It doesn't erase who you were before. Who I was before is someone you barely remember," Kesvala pointed out. "I have perfect crystallized memories of our friendship. You have fragments and impressions. We're not connecting to the same shared past." "No," Nathan agreed. "But we're connecting to the same past importance. You remember perfectly, I remember imperfectly, but we both remember that it mattered. That's enough to build from." Nathan stayed on Veltharion Prime in a capacity that baffled the imperial court. He wasn't a diplomat, wasn't an advisor, wasn't anyone with official position, but the Empress clearly valued his presence in ways that made him untouchable by normal court politics. He attended court functions where he was introduced as childhood friend, rather than by any title, which scandalized traditionalists who thought the Empress should maintain more dignified distance from common associations. He had weekly dinners with Kesvala where they talked about everything and nothing, reconnecting across decades with full awareness that they were different people than the children who'd shared stolen rations. Kesvala showed him more memory crystals, moments he'd completely forgotten, but that she'd preserved with perfect clarity. The time they'd found an abandoned playground and spent hours on broken equipment pretending they were explorers on alien worlds. The day he'd taught her a human card game, and she'd accused him of cheating when she lost. The night they'd watched a meteor shower from the roof of their favorite building, and made wishes they both knew wouldn't come true but made anyway because pretending felt good. "You remember me better than I remember myself," Nathan said, watching holographic versions of their childhood selves. "I remember who you were," Kesvala corrected. "I don't know who you are now. That's what we're building." They built it slowly, carefully, with full acknowledgement of the complications. Nathan was a middle-aged engineer from Earth who designed wastewater systems, and had two grown children who thought their father's new friendship with an alien empress was the weirdest midlife development imaginable. Kesvala was an absolute monarch who commanded fleets and reshaped star systems, and carried the weight of billions of lives in her decisions. But she was also still Kes when they were alone. The girl who'd been lonely on a frontier colony, who'd hidden her identity to survive, who'd found genuine friendship with a human boy who saw her as person rather than potential threat or resource. "Do you regret it?" Nathan asked one evening, watching Veltharion's 3 moons rise over the capital, becoming Empress instead of getting to stay normal Kes. "I didn't have choice," Kesvala said. "Succession crisis resolved. My family needed heir. I was called back." She paused. "But sometimes I wonder what life would have been like if I'd stayed on New Meridian, if the colony had succeeded, if I could have just been Kes forever with Nathan as my best friend and no crowns or politics or power." "You'd probably be an engineer too," Nathan said. "You were always good at figuring out how broken things worked. We could have designed wastewater systems together," Kesvala said, and her tone suggested she was genuinely considering the alternate timeline. "Lived normal lives, grown old without the weight of empires. Instead you rule 14 star systems, and I occasionally visit to remind you that you once stole ration packs with a human kid who made terrible penguin jokes." "Those jokes weren't terrible," Kesvala said. "They were perfect because you told them trying to make me laugh." She pulled up another memory, Nathan's younger self doing the penguin waddle that holographic Kes found hilarious. "This is more valuable to me than any state ceremony, more real than my coronation. Because this was before I had to be Empress, when I was just Kes being friends with Nathan who didn't care that I was different." "You're still different," Nathan pointed out. "You're still an Empress, I'm still just an engineer." "But you're here," Kesvala said simply. "Despite the decades and the power differential and the fact that I remember our childhood perfectly while you barely remember half of it. You came looking for me anyway. That matters more than any throne." Nathan's daughter sent messages asking when he was coming back to Earth, and he kept postponing return dates because his childhood friend needed someone who remembered when she was just Kes, and apparently that was more valuable than any diplomatic credential could provide. Kesvala's log entries noted that she'd spent 40 years mourning the boy from New Meridian, keeping his memory crystallized as reminder of who she was before power consumed everything else. And now, he was alive and here, and he remembered her too, even if his human memories were fragmentary compared to her perfect recollections. The childhood companion who became an empress never forgot their friendship, and that changed everything. not by erasing the decades or the power differential or the fundamental differences in how their species remembered, but by proving that some connections mattered enough to survive impossible circumstances and transformation into people neither child could have imagined becoming. Somewhere in the imperial palace, two middle-aged beings, one human engineer, one alien empress, watched holographic memories of children who'd shared rations in abandoned buildings and tried to figure out who those children had become. The answer was complicated, messy, and involved power dynamics that made simple friendship almost impossible. But they were building it anyway, one imperfect memory and one crystallized recollection at a time. Because Kess never forgot Nathan, and Nathan never stopped looking for Kess. And sometimes that was enough to bridge empires and decades and the fundamental asymmetry of how different species remember what mattered. The reunion had shattered both their carefully constructed identities, but maybe what they built from the pieces would be stronger for the breaking.